The question often arises, where do we find teaching on deification, let's say, in the early Christian period among the church fathers in the first some centuries? Because this is where the doctrine of deification develops. I tend to look to 4 or 5 main figures. There are many across the board who teach on it, but I would first of all point us to Irenaeus, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. He was recently named a doctor of the church. In his work Adversus Against Heresies, especially books 3 to 5, you'll find there a very rich account of what we've come to know as the doctrine of deification. He doesn't use the technical terminology, but he's the one who really develops this formula of exchange that God became like we are so that we could become like he is. And in his theology, you see a very rich account of what we call deification unfolded. After him, I turn to Athanasius of Alexandria, writing in the mid-4th century. His works against the Arians and his letters to Serapion, in both of them, you get a remarkably rich account of how Christ in his incarnation brings about the deification of the human race and in our own lives. And he uses the technical terminology. He uses all the various means and phrases, you might say. But he develops it very much in the context of an account of Christian doctrine and truth. I'd also point us to another writer, a younger contemporary of Athanasius, named Gregory of Nazianzus. In his various orations, he gives an account of deification that's very impressive, very deep, very thoughtful. For my own study, I focused on St. Cyril of Alexandria, who was writing in the early 5th century. Particularly his commentary on John, I would point us to. Cyril is so rich in understanding how God, through the incarnation of the Word, brought about the transformation of our nature in the Word and brings us through the sacraments and the moral life into this likeness and image of God. Very rich account. Finally, I'd point us to St. Maximus the Confessor, writing in the early 600s. Maximus is often seen as kind of the culmination of the early teaching on deification. He really explores in a very daring way, you might say, what it means that God became man so that we might become God and become like God. So these are the 4 or 5 sources that I would point to that are especially representative of the doctrine of deification in the early church. Where do we look for writers, let's say in the more contemporary period, the last 100, 150 years, who particularly exemplify in their writings an account of deification, either explicitly or implicitly? I might point us to 2 or 3 figures. A writer from the 19th century, dogmatic theologian, a German theologian by the name of Matthias Scheeben, is particularly rich in his account of deification. In fact, having discovered him, I'm amazed how much the notion of deification runs through his immense works of theology. Scheeben is now considered one of the great theologians of the 19th century, looking back. And it's absolutely full of teaching on deification. So you couldn't do better than looking to some of his works on the mysteries and on the divine life. Another figure from the 19th century, very well known, is St. John Henry Newman. Now, Newman does not tend to use the language of deification, terminology explicitly very often, but he has an approach to the faith very much drawing on Athanasius, Cyril, and others. He read these church fathers extensively, and when you read especially his parochial and plain sermons, others of his works, you'll see in Newman this notion that salvation is a life of divine filiation through the indwelling of the Spirit, through participating in God. These are all very rich themes in Newman. A third figure, a little bit more contemporary, is Abbot Columba Marmion. His works are highly prized. They're a bit more popular, and that makes them rather accessible. But Marmion is you might say, entranced by the doctrine of deification and speaks about participation in the life of God very, very richly. Many other figures one could name, but these are three that I would recommend if you're looking for relatively contemporary figures who write from the perspective of deification. When it comes to contemporary writings about deification, studies of deification, there are really quite a number that have emerged, let's say, in the last 25 to 30 years. Of the many that you could read, let me mention a few that I've found particularly helpful. Norman Russell is a writer on deification in terms of its history, and he's unmatched in the scope of his writing. Norman Russell wrote a book called The Doctrine of Deification in the Greek Patristic Tradition, a kind of thick book, but immensely thorough. In that book, he not only covers the Greek tradition, but then he covers the Latin writers in a short appendix and more contemporary ones. So he covers a lot of ground in that study, and it's a landmark study that still pays benefits by reading. As a companion volume to that, I'd recommend a volume that was edited by Dr. Jared Ortiz called Deification in the Latin Patristic Tradition. Dr. Ortiz was looking to do something similar, maybe not as thorough as Norman Russell did, looking to do it for the West as Russell did it for the East. And there are many excellent studies of Western Latin writing church fathers it's very valuable addition to get access to them. When it comes to understanding just what deification is, I might recommend my own short study, which I was invited to write, called Deification and Grace. I was asked actually to put that together in a short version of about 125 pages. It's 20 years old, but I think it still conveys helpfully through the tradition a basic understanding of deification if you're looking to get a good start. Finally, if you're looking for a much more thorough account of deification across the traditions from every angle, the recently published Oxford Handbook of Deification has between 40 and 50 very learned articles about deification from almost every angle you could imagine. And so I'd commend that for a kind of thorough study, updated on the doctrine itself.